Hey coders, I've got an interesting lesson for you today. This one is going to cover how to plot Bitcoin gaps. So right now I am on the Bitcoin futures market chart, and you can see here that this script is plotting any gaps that occur in price action until that gap is filled. Notice that on this Bitcoin futures chart, whenever there's a decent sized gap, the market almost always ends up filling that gap at some point. And in fact, if you look at this whole chart, every single major gap on this chart has been filled by Bitcoin. So there's a 100% chance that these gaps are going to be filled so far, according to Bitcoin's historical price action. At least 5% gaps. I have this script set to detect 5% minimum gap. So in this lesson, I'm going to show you how I wrote this script, and then maybe you can play around with it yourself and improve it. But before I continue, I should point out that this is plotting Bitcoin's gaps on any Bitcoin market you load. So if I load BitMEX's perpetual swap contract, you can see that it's still plotting the gaps even though there are no gaps on this chart. So if you don't trade Bitcoin through the CME futures exchange, but you trade it through some other exchange, even let's say Coinbase, for example, the gaps are still drawn onto the chart. So it's still referencing the CME data so that we can get these gaps. So it's actually quite an interesting script. So thank you, Anthony, for submitting this question. And without any further ado, let's get into the coding. So here I am with a blank script. All I've done is change the precision of the script to 3 and the overlay to true. And we're just plotting the closing price right now. So as always, I like to start my script by getting some user input. And in this particular case, we're going to get 3 different inputs from our user. So I'm going to title this comment, get user input. The first input we're going to get is the market to reference. Now this is an optional thing. You could just hard code this script to reference the Bitcoin futures market. Let me load that up real quick just so we know what we're working with. BTC1 exclamation mark will get you the Bitcoin futures continuous contract from the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. If I load that up, here we go. So what we're going to do is I'm going to create an input here, and I'm going to title it market. Let's just title it reference market. And I'm going to give it a type of input.string and a default value of this market we're on right now, BTC1 exclamation mark. The next thing we're going to do is define our minimum gap that we want to detect in this script. So this is going to be another input title, minimum gap percentage, and this is going to be a type of input.float with a default value of, let's just say 5.0, because that's what I have found works best for this example, but you can set this to whatever you want. And we'll set the minimum value as well here while we're at it to, let's just go 0.01. And then finally, the last user input we're going to get is a Boolean input to override new gaps. And this will make sense later. I'm not going to explain what this does just yet because it'll make perfect sense when we have our code written. But I'm going to title this override on new gaps. And we'll give this a type of input.bool with a default value of false. I'm going to leave this turned off by default in my script, but you can set this on by default if you want to in yours. As always, this is just a guideline. You don't have to copy me note for note. I'm just doing this to demonstrate how you might go about doing this. So the next thing we're going to do is get our Bitcoin price data from the BTC CME futures contract. So for that, we're going to use the security function, which hopefully you're familiar with by now if you're in this mentorship program. But if you're not, don't worry, we'll go through it now. So we're going to use the security function, and this security function takes a number of inputs. It takes a symbol, resolution, an expression, which is like an open, high, low, close, or an indicator value, anything like that. And then our gaps and look ahead, we're not going to use that in this particular case because the default settings for those 2 variables will just do fine for now. So the symbol we're going to reference is our market to reference. And that's this variable we created here. So by default, it's going to be BTC1 exclamation mark. The time frame we're going to reference, I'm just going to hard code this as the daily chart because there's not often that anyone would ever want to check gaps on a 4-hour or intraday chart. Maybe a weekly chart could be interesting, but for the demonstration purposes of this lesson, I'm just going to leave it as daily, but you could change this to a user input if you want to. You just set it to a resolution input dot resolution type if you want to do that. But I'm not going to do that for now. I'm going to leave that as it is. And because this is a BTC open variable, we're just going to reference the open price. But to avoid repainting, we need to check, is the bar state a real-time bar? And if it is, we want to reference yesterday's bar. Otherwise, we do want to reference the current index, which is 0. So on historical bars, we'll be referencing that bar itself. But on current bars like this bar right now, we don't want to reference this open. We want to reference yesterday's open. And that will prevent the script from repainting and will stop us from getting dodgy results on our chart. It's typically a good idea to do this whenever you're using the security function. You'll know when you don't want to use it. It'll be quite obvious. But if you're not sure, when in doubt, just add this little bit of this conditional statement in here, and it will solve a lot of problems that you might run into when using the security function, especially on intraday time frames. But let's move on. The next variable we need is the Bitcoin high, and this is going to be the same. So I'm just going to copy this line of code and paste it 4 times. I'm going to change this to say BTC high, low, and close, and do the same here. High, low, close. Done. There's our Bitcoin price data, and we can now move on to the fun part, which is calculating our gap. Calculate gap percentage. So I've already done a lesson on this in the mastery course. I'll leave a link in this underneath this video to that lesson if you're unsure about what I'm about to do here. But the formula to calculate a gap between candles is quite simple. All we need to do here is I'm going to create a new variable called gap percent, and I'm going to set it to 2 open brackets, BTC open minus the BTC close of the previous bar divided by the current BTC open times 100. We'll convert that into a whole number percentage value. And that's it. We are now calculating the gap magnitude. So if I zoom in here, this formula here will, on this example here that I've got my mouse over, the market opened right where my mouse is, and the market closed right then at around $10,030, which is a gap of around 13.87%. That is what this line of code here will give us if we run it, roughly 13%. So if I copy this down to our plot and I save the script, now if I hover my mouse over here, you can see up here in the top left here, it says minus 13.719%. That's the magnitude of the gap from this bar down to this bar. So far so good. Now all we need to do is store whenever we detect a large gap like this, we want to store this bar, the origin of the gap. We want to store the low in the case of a bearish gap. We want to store the low so that we can see if the market will come back up to retest this low and essentially fill the gap. You could adjust this script to go by open and closes too if you wanted to. But for demonstration purposes here, I thought it might be more interesting to just go with the low. And obviously the opposite for bullish gaps. So whenever there's a bullish gap like this, we want to draw the high, or we want to save the high and draw that across our chart until it gets filled. So let's do that here. The next thing I need to do is declare gap variables. And so this is going to store our gaps across all the bars on our chart. So we're creating, I'm not sure what the official name is in PineScript, but I like to call it a persistent variable. It's not a constant variable, but it is a persistent variable, meaning it won't change on any new bars until we tell it to. So if we type var, that will declare a persistent variable. And this first one I'm going to call is, this first variable I'm going to call last bullish gap level. And that's going to be set to BTC high by default. Now, when this variable is very first initiated, it's initiated on the very first bar that's loaded onto the chart. So the very first time this variable is created, it will be set to the Bitcoin high, which is fine for our demonstration purposes here. The next persistent variable I'm going to create is called last bearish gap level, and that'll be set to the BTC low. And then I also thought it might be interesting to add alert functionality to the script. So I need to create one more variable, and this is just going to be a standard variable that will reset on every new bar. It's going to be called gap alert. It's just a Boolean. When this is set to true, we'll have our alert condition, which we'll write later, trigger an alert so that you can monitor any large gaps on the Bitcoin chart. All right, let's move on to the next section, which is storing our bullish and bearish gap data. So the first one I'm going to store is our bullish gap information. And we're going to use an if statement here. We're going to say if the gap percent, this variable here, is greater than or equal to our minimum gap variable setting here, then we can store our bullish gap level. So assign that to the BTC high of the previous bar, because remember, this condition will only be set to true after the gap has occurred. And so we need to reference the previous bar in order to get that previous high of the gap origin, essentially. And then we're also going to set our gap alert variable to true so that later on we can trigger an alert whenever this condition is met. The next thing we do, I'm just going to copy this. The next thing we need to do is do the same for our bearish gap data. So the difference here is we're going to set if the gap percent is less than or equal to, and remember that a bearish gap will be a negative number. If you look up here, it says negative 10. So this was a negative, roughly negative 10 percentage gap. So we need to add a minus sign in front of this minimum gap variable. So that will flip this to a negative number. So this condition will only return true if our gap percentage is less than or equal to negative 5. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, I'm sure it will later. Just rewatch the video, and of course, just shoot me an email if you have any questions. And of course, we need to change this to bearish and this to the BTC low. So now we're detecting gaps. We're setting our alert condition to true for later on, and we're storing the previous origin of the gap. And this is what we expect to be filled. We expect price to eventually come back down in the case of a bullish gap to touch the previous high preceding the gap, and vice versa for lows on bearish gaps. So what we need to do before we continue and start drawing this to our chart is we need to reset our gap levels whenever price fills them. So for example, in this bullish gap here, when this gap occurred, we want to draw this line across our chart until a candle's low exceeds the swing high or the previous gap high. Once that happens, we want to reset our stored gap variable. And what we're going to do in order to achieve that is just set it to NA, not a number. So I'll show you what I mean now, and hopefully this will make perfect sense. So if bullish gap level is filled, we want to reset our gap level. So if the current BTC low, so if the current low of Bitcoin on the daily chart is less than or equal to our last bullish gap level, then we want to set our last bullish gap level to NA. And we obviously want to do the same thing for our bearish gaps. So here I'm just going to copy and paste this block of code. We'll change this to say bearish gap level, change this to high, and flip that operator to greater than or equal to, and then I'll just copy and paste that there. So for bearish gaps, if the Bitcoin high, the daily chart high, exceeds the last saved bearish gap level, then we want to reset our bearish gap level. In other words, just stop plotting it onto the chart because it's been filled. There's no sense to continuing drawing it after it's been filled. We'll just reset the variable to NA until a new gap is detected. So that's it. We're pretty much done. Now all we need to do is draw the data to our chart. So the first thing I like to do with a script like this is plot the actual gap percent. I've already written that there. I don't know why I'm rewriting that. So let's just work with this. We've got a plot function that's just plotting our gap percent. But I don't want it visually drawn onto the chart. So what I'm going to do here, first of all, I'll set the color to color the orange so that it's different from our red and green gap levels, and I'll delete this line so we no longer need it. And I'm going to set the transparency of this plot to 100% so that we get the number drawn to our chart still, but it's not drawn onto our actual chart visually. We don't need to see this value on our chart, on our bar chart. We just need to see the indicator value up in the top left there. So if we set that to 100% transparency, that'll still draw our gap percent. If I save the script, it'll reload, change the color to orange, and nothing has changed except that if we zoom right out, you can't see any lines being drawn on the chart. If I set that back to 0 and save the script, you'll see that we have the line drawing onto our actual chart, which can be annoying. In this case, it's not that important because Bitcoin is so highly priced that you'd never see it if you're on auto. But if you did zoom your chart right out, you would see it there. So for indicator variables or values like this, this is an easy way to have it plot onto your chart without a visual representation of it. So that's why I do that. And finally, let's plot our gaps. So I'm going to plot our last bullish gap level with a color of color.green, a style of plot.style_line break. So this will break the line between new gaps. If you don't have this in, then whenever a gap gets filled, when another gap is detected, you'll get this sloped line connecting the two plots. We don't want that. We just want the line to stop, to break until a new plot is drawn. And then finally, let's set the 2, and we should probably title this plot as well, last bullish gap. And while we're at it, let's title this to gap percent. And the reason for that is that when you come up into the settings menu, go to style, it'll just change the name of this plot so that any users who want to come in here and adjust this color, for example, can do so easily. And I can just copy this line of code here, paste it down there, change this to bearish, change this to red, change this to bearish, and we're essentially done. If I save the script, we're going to be plotting these gaps onto our chart, as you can see here. Perfect. Everything is working as desired. But we haven't taken into account our override on new gaps variable. So let's go and add that in now. So if I open up the editor again and we come up to here, what we want to say here is if the gap percent is greater than or equal to our minimum gap and our last bullish gap level is not a number, that's what this function does. Now remember, you have to use this NA function in order to check if this is an NA variable value, because if you were to do it like this, you can get some I'm not sure why. I'm not 100% sure actually how this works in the Pine engine, but apparently according to the Pine script documentation, you can get some wacky results from using this equals sign against an NA value. So the correct way to check if this value of this variable has a value of NA is to use the inbuilt NA function that will return true if this variable is set to NA. But we also need to add on another condition here to say, or override new gaps, which is this variable up here, this setting up here. So now if I copy this line and paste it down here, change this to bearish, and we save the script, this little line here will go away, as you can see. The reason for that is that this gap hasn't been filled yet. So if I come up to the settings and we turn override on new gaps to on, the script will override any new gaps, whether they've been filled or not. So whenever a new gap is detected, this line will change. Whereas if you turn that off, this line will continue to draw until that gap gets filled. So that's why I added that setting in. I hope that makes sense now. And our script is pretty much complete, I believe. Let's just have a look over everything. And I'll do one last little run through on what we've done here. But before we do wrap it up, let's just add in our trigger alert whenever a large gap is detected. And this is easy. Just use the alert condition, pass it our gap alert variable here, give it a title of whatever you want. I'm going to call this BTC gap detected, and a message of gap detected for BTC. And just because we can, I'm also going to add in our plot 0 placeholder, special placeholder. So the PineScript engine will replace this little block of this little expression here, two curly brackets with plot_0, with the very first plot that our script generates. So when you receive this alert, the message you get in your email or push notification or whatever, however you set your alert up, will contain the gap percentage, which is this orange number up here. So you can see at a glance within your alert message exactly how large that gap is. And I think we can add a percentage sign on here without any issues. And so, for example, on this gap here, we had a 6.895% gap. So this would be changed to 6.895 in your alert message. So if we change this to 1, then this will plot the actual bullish gap level price into our alert message. But let's leave it as that. And that's the end of our script. We have completed a successful Bitcoin gap detection script. So now if I reset the chart, zoom out a bit, let's go to XBT/USD, good old BitMEX. But there we go. It's plotting the gaps from the Bitcoin CME data feed. So this is working as intended. Let's get rid of that. Load up one other Bitcoin chart just to make sure. And let's do a different one this time. Let's go with Gemini. And yeah, it's working perfectly. Very nice. So now, of course, you can come up here and play around with these settings if you want to. For example, you could detect smaller gaps, 1% gaps. Or you could detect much larger gaps, so 10% gaps. And this data feed has its own gaps, so that's throwing this off a little bit. If we go back to BTC1 exclamation mark, and we go all the way back there, you'll see that it is plotting correctly. And you'll have to play around with the settings. There are a bunch of gaps being detected in here that don't look like gaps because the wicks are already filling the gap before it's plotting. So you might want to play around with this code and try to detect clear gaps like this. So you could check the gap from the wick to the next wick, for example. So from the high of the candle to the next low, instead of from the close of the previous candle to the next candle's open. Again, if you go to my gap percentage lesson in the mastery course, which I'll leave a link to below, you'll get a little bit more information about how to detect different style of gaps that you can play around with there. But if we come up and turn this override new gaps off, then we do get a little bit more of a consistent gap drawing there. But of course, if there is a large gap that does not get filled by price action, that'll continue drawing on your chart for quite a while. So you might want to come in here and play around with these values until you find one that works best for you. And of course, this is a float value, so you could change this to something like 7.5 if you wanted to, and that'll still work just fine. And so that's it for this lesson. I hope you found that interesting and helpful in your own coding. Good luck with your coding. Let me know if you come up with any interesting use cases for this type of code, especially you, Anthony. I know you're working on some cool stuff with this and your own scripts. And that's it. I'll see you in the next lesson.